Hello, this is Peter Whitehead with another one of my presentations that I originally produced for the Bromley University of the Third Age Art Appreciation Group, a group of people who get together to talk about art and enjoy art but are not necessarily experts on it. So today I'm going to talk about Auguste Rodin, probably the most famous sculptor of the late 19th and early 20th century. Many of his works are extremely well known and recognisable. But Rodin wasn't a success in artistic terms until middle age. And I think Rodin also gives us an opportunity to consider how art is made in the modern age and what an artwork really is. So the talk has been inspired, at least in part, by a visit to the Tate Modern to see this exhibition, which I think is open until November 2021. And the presentation includes some photographs that I took at that exhibition. But let's have some biographical details first. So François Auguste René Rodin was born to a fairly working class background. His father was an inspector in the Paris police department, born in 1840, and he died in the First World War, or during the course of the First World War, not as a result of the First World War, in 1917. He attended the Petite École as a teenager. That was the kind of junior version of the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the main training establishment for artists in Paris. But he actually failed to get accepted at the senior school. He'd studied drawing and painting at the Petite École, and having failed to gain admittance to the École des Beaux-Arts, he earns a living by working in the applied arts, making not one-off artworks but decorative pieces which will need to be made in their hundreds or thousands. And I think these are techniques that Rodin will use later. He has a short spell in a religious order, but is very quickly told the religious life isn't for you. You should focus on art, so that is what you're good at. And then 1870 comes along when Rodin is 30. 1870 is the Franco-Prussian War. Lots of artists, musicians, composers flee France at this point. Rodin has a short spell in the army, but he is considered his health isn't good enough for him to fight. He therefore decamps to Belgium, where he stays for the next 6 years. But he also visits Italy in 1875, and these are important years for him. In Belgium, in Brussels, he works on the decoration of the Brussels Stock Exchange. And when he visits Italy, he sees in the flesh for the first time the sculptures of Michelangelo and Donatello. Here are some photos of Rodin, very early one, 1862, a rather surly 22-year-old, you'd have to say. Possibly I'm doing him a disservice. He probably had to sit still for 5 minutes for that photograph to be taken. By 1902, that's the Rodin we possibly recognise more at the height of his fame. So this was Rodin's first serious piece designed as a work of art rather than a decorative piece. He was a relative unknown when this was exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1877, and Rodin is 37 at this time. It had various titles before the Age of Bronze was settled on, modelled by a Belgian soldier, Auguste Rodin. But in terms of pose and finish, the work is pretty clearly influenced by Michelangelo, and particularly by his dying slave, which was originally been designed for the tomb of Pope Julius. I'm not sure whether Rodin saw this on his travels in Italy or whether he saw it in the Louvre, because that's where it is at the moment, so I don't know at what stage it gets appropriated by the Louvre. But in terms of the pose, I think you can see the similarities. But the critics are a bit puzzled by the work. Who is this naked man? What religious, mythological, historical or literary subject did he represent? Because that was what sculpture was for in the late 1870s. You had to be showing something, you had to be showing a famous person, a scene from mythology, or something similar to that, but this was just a Belgian soldier in a pose. The work itself led to controversy. It was so lifelike, and in fact it's life size as well, that Rodin was accused of casting it from life. In other words, coating the poor soldier in plaster of Paris to form a mould, which was then cast in bronze. So he didn't really do any sculpting, he just took an impression of the soldier's body. Rodin took a lot of effort to rebut this charge. He thought he was being accused of cheating, which I suppose he was, and he took photographs of the naked model, compared them with the sculpture, demonstrating where there were differences, just to prove that this was not a direct cast of the soldier. But Rodin took care that he couldn't be accused of this again. His next sculpture of St. John the Baptist is more than life size. It's 6'7" tall, in fact. But it's unconventional. Where are St. John's usual attributes? St. John the Baptist usually wears an animal skin. He's usually accompanied by a lamb. How are we meant to know in this figure, if we weren't told from the title, that it's John the Baptist? But Rodin was starting to be recognised. He was starting to get support from the French government. The government arranged for the age of bronze to be cast in bronze, and they also bought the bronze of John the Baptist. We'll look at the way in which sculptures were created in a short while, which will explain a bit about casting. But at the time, Rodin was employed in the design department at the Sèvres porcelain factory, the government-owned porcelain factory in France. And the titans on this jardinière at the base of it were all modelled by Rodin. But you can see what I mean about the need to produce something that could be reproduced time after time after time. This was a piece that anyone could buy. It was not a one-off. It's something you could go to the French equivalent of Liberty's and buy. But Rodin's big breakthrough is about to arrive. In 1880, he was commissioned to design the entrance to a proposed museum of decorative arts, and in fact that museum was never built, and so the entrance was never needed. But Rodin designed an entrance based on Dante's Inferno, with influences from Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, particularly the way the whole concept is unified and is not divided into panels depicting individual scenes. And Rodin worked on this piece until his death. And the link with the Sistine Chapel, if you think of the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, Christ is in the centre, and around him all these scenes take place of people ascending to heaven, people descending to hell, and Rodin kind of adopts that approach to a certain extent. There are over 180 figures on the gates of hell. Some of them then took on a life of their own, and versions of them were exhibited as individual works, which we will look at separately. Some works were designed to be incorporated in the gates of hell, but did not form part of the final design. As I said, Rodin was working on this and changing the design over a period of nearly 40 years. But you can see on the gates of hell, the figure that we know, the thinker, is in the centre there, sitting at the top. We'll come across the three shades later on, and other figures which took on a life of their own. Originally, the gates of hell were designed to be flanked by figures of Adam and Eve. So this is the figure of Adam. It was never formed part as Adam of the gates of hell. Thinking back to Michelangelo again, if you look at Adam's right hand and his extended index finger, it's the same pose as the famous section of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, where the index fingers of God and Adam almost touch as Adam receives life from God. So that's the figure of Adam. These are the three figures that sit at the top of the gates of hell. The shades are ghosts of the dead who are doomed because of the god's displeasure to roam the underworld forever and never enter the Elysian fields. But actually, the shades are three versions of Adam, each one turned through 90 degrees. So if you look at those three figures on the left, Adam is on the right. Of the three figures, the one on the left is very much in the same pose, but if you turn that pose through 90 degrees, you get the center figure. Turn it again through 90 degrees, you get the third figure. So Rodin is using the same figure 3 times to produce the sculpture of the shades. And this recycling of figures or parts of figures became a very important part of Rodin's work. It challenges the accepted view and the historic emphasis on sculptures as unique objects. In Rodin's world, they are not unique. They are there to be repurposed, taken apart and put together again. I mentioned the thinker, probably the best known of Rodin's works. On the gates of hell, the figure represents Dante reflecting on what he has experienced in the underworld. A version of this sculpture, the one on the right, sits on Rodin's grave. And from the same year we have the Kiss, intended originally for the Paolo and Francesca section of the gates, but replaced by a different set of figures. So Paolo and Francesca were brother and sister-in-law, I think, condemned to one of the lowest circles of hell in Dante's Inferno for committing adultery. And this is Paolo and Francesca. For those who enjoy music, it's Francesca da Rimini. But at this point it might be worthwhile looking at methods and techniques of sculpture. So a sculpture can be carved from wood or marble or stone, and here the sculpture removes material which is not required. And Rodin, in fact, never carved in wood or marble. The other technique is casting, where molds are created into which various materials can be poured, so molten metal and glass, concrete or resin. By the end of the 19th century, developments in technology had meant that casting had become much more economic, and it was also the technique used to make the decorative items, which Rodin had been working on as a younger man. But it also means that the sculptor needs technical specialists in his or her studio. Rodin generally produced the first clay models of his pieces, but these would then be handed to specialists to produce molds and to cast them in plaster or metal, to transfer the model to marble via a pointing machine, or to resize the piece using a pantograph. So unlike, for example, Michelangelo, who we tend to think of as a sculptor who worked on his own, though I doubt whether that's actually the case, Rodin is very much the first stage of the process, and it then gets handed over to technicians who turn that clay sculpture into a bronze or a marble piece. So if we look at casting in particular, which is the technique that Rodin uses, there are various ways to produce casts. The hot wax method is one that's been used since antiquity. You produce a wax model, you cover it in plaster, heat it up, the wax melts, and you're left with impression in the plaster. So that's a very simple technique. But what Rodin used, as I said, was clay models. He'd produced clay models which were then used to produce the plaster casts. Now the plaster casts are quite cheap. You can produce any number of those, and you would only cast the sculpture in bronze at the final stage, when the design had been accepted by whomever had commissioned the work. Rodin saved the plaster casts, and these were in fact the basis of the exhibition at the Tate Modern that I went to, and the cast could then be used as the basis for future works or parts of them. So we looked at the bronze of John the Baptist. In Rodin's later work there's a figure called the Walking Man, and the Walking Man has exactly the same legs as John the Baptist. So Rodin would break these works into their component parts, which is the fragmentation, stick them together in a different arrangement, assemblage, and use the same element in different ways. This is seriality. Those are the techniques that Rodin used. So the other way of casting figures is by sand casting, where you essentially press the model into sand to leave an impression, and then use that for the casting. Well, what this meant is that Rodin built up a collection of body parts which he called his giblets, and we see here a collection of hands and arms which Rodin could use in his larger works. It's a stockpile, if you like, of body parts. There's an interesting link here to medical matters. The Musée Charcot Museum of Pathological Anatomy at the L'Hôpital de la Salpêtrière in Paris had a collection of medical exhibits. It was the way in which medical students at this time would study disease, anatomy, the dissecting of executed criminals had come to an end, so producing wax or plaster models of things had become a very skilled task, and there were quite a lot of wax casts which Rodin would have seen of characteristics of disease for medical study and education, and possibly Rodin uses that approach to create his own set which he can put together. So these are plaster casts at the Tate of Rodin's next great commission. The story of the burghers of Calais is that Calais was under siege by Edward III, and he agreed to lift the siege if 6 of its principal citizens presented themselves to him with the ropes around their necks ready for execution. They were actually spared by the intervention of Queen Philippa. So in 1884, Rodin is commissioned by the town of Calais to produce a memorial to these heroic men. And as was becoming usual with Rodin, the town did not get quite what they were expecting. Rather than the heroic idealised figures on a plinth that might have been expected based on the classical tradition, Rodin depicted the men in a much more naturalistic way, dignified but not necessarily heroic, and viewed at ground level. The burghers were first modelled unclothed. Tunics dipped in plaster were draped over the nude sculptures. And Rodin wanted the sculpture to be at the same level as the viewer, not on a plinth, to emphasise the common humanity that the burghers held with the viewer, and this wasn't obviously the usual practice. So these are the plaster models, and if you go to Calais outside the town hall, this is the finished work, or should I say one of the finished works, because what the casting process does is allow more than one so-called original to be produced. So for Rodin's sculptures, we have to really stop thinking of them as individual works of art. It's much easier. You don't need to go to Calais to see the burghers of Calais. You can see them in Westminster. This is alongside the Houses of Parliament in Victoria Gardens, I think it's called. A cast, exactly the same cast as you'll see in Calais, presented to this country. And if you go to America, to Stanford University, there you'll see the 6 burghers of Calais, but they've been separated and stand alone rather than as a group. So whereas we might have been used in the past to consider that there's only one definitive work, one definitive version of a work of art, one Mona Lisa for instance, or one Fighting Temeraire, or one statue of David by Michelangelo, the casting process allows for more than one original. In fact, under French law there can be up to 12 original versions. But technology also means there can be many copies of various sizes, and this is why you see reproductions of, say, the Kiss or the Thinker of all different sizes, from ones about 6 inches tall to, you know, the ones that are the same size as the original, in inverted commas, if that's what I can call it. The exhibition in the Tate had these plaster versions of the hands of 2 of the figures of the burghers of Calais, Pierre and Jacques de Wissant. But on closer inspection, you'll see this is the same hand posed in 2 different ways for each figure. Now we have to tackle the difficult subject of Rodin and women. He seems to have been a bit of a sexual predator. He had a relationship with a laundress called Rose Beuret from 1864 and a son with her, but he never acknowledged that son, and he didn't marry Rose until 1917, 2 weeks before her death. In the meantime, he had many mistresses amongst his models and female students. Camille Claudel, who we see here, was one of his assistants, originally a talented sculptress in her own right, and his mistress from 1883 to 1898. She had a sad end, being committed by her family to a mental institution in 1913 after displaying symptoms of paranoia and schizophrenia. This is a mask of Rose Beuret, Rodin's eventual wife. The photo on the right shows how the mask emerged from the casting process and how it needed to be cleaned up through a process which is known as fettling. So you remove all these obvious joins in the mould through fettling to produce the work on the left. But Rodin actually was more than happy in some cases to leave his work in this partially unfinished state. And also think back to the problems with the Age of Bronze, being accused of casting from life. Well, if you leave the evidence of the casting on the work, that accusation can't be thrown at you. This is Rodin in the style of Rodin, of later Rodin, by Camille Claudel. Women in this period were not admitted to study in the École des Beaux-Arts, so women had to train privately or work in effect as an apprentice to an established artist, which is how Claudel came into contact with Rodin. The next major commission for Rodin was a memorial to Balzac, the writer who had died in 1850. You won't be surprised to hear that the Société des Gens de Lettres didn't like what they got. Rodin took the plaster cast home, and in fact the figure wasn't cast in bronze until 1939. The controversy over this figure, which again wasn't considered heroic enough. If you want a sculpture of a great man, you want to see him posed as a great man, and the figure of Balzac didn't seem to do that to the people who commissioned it. But the controversy pitted Monet, Cézanne, Toulouse-Lautrec, who were all supporters of Rodin, against the more conservative elements in the art world, who were continuing to look for something much more representational. And if you think that's a issue that crops up even today, I think it was last year that Maggie Hamblin's A Sculpture for Mary Wollstonecraft was exhibited, and lots of people said it doesn't look anything like her, to which the answer was it's not meant to be her, it's a sculpture for Mary Wollstonecraft, not of. And if you look at the dates of this figure, it also somehow seems to get enmeshed in the Dreyfus affair, which split France down the middle, the ones who supported the government and the army in their anti-Semitic persecution of Alfred Dreyfus, and the much more radical figures such as Zola, Émile Zola, the writer, who accused the government of dishonesty, which they were being dishonest. They were being anti-Semitic about the whole thing, and the division in society was replicated, and the people who attacked the government over the Dreyfus affair supported Rodin with this sculpture. The ones who didn't attacked him. So we can see from the exhibition at the Tate some of the processes that went into making this figure. There's the plaster cast on the left. Balzac used to work through the night, dressed in an old dressing gown and fueled by coffee, and this is what Rodin is trying to capture in the work, the act of creation of Balzac. He made many studies for the piece, including on the right a naked figure of Balzac. Obviously he couldn't model it from Balzac. He'd been dead for nearly 50 years by the time this was created. He actually went to the part of the world that Balzac came from and found someone who he felt looked like Balzac and used him as the model. And here's a model of just the dressing gown. And a cast of part of the final work, for the unclothed part to which the dressing gown has not been added. So this illustrates Rodin's approach in putting various elements of the sculpture together and getting those elements produced in, I suppose, in sketch form, we would say, if it was a work of art, drawing or painting, and then assembling the final thing. But importantly for us, he kept all the various elements. We'll see where in a minute. So incidentally, Kenneth Clark of the TV programme Civilization fame thought that Rodin's Balzac was the most important work of sculpture of the 19th century, and in fact the most important since Michelangelo. It's also called the first modern sculpture. If you want to see it, it can be found on the Boulevard du Montparnasse in Paris, but other casts can be found in 5 different museums in the United States, including the Metropolitan and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. You can see it at the Musée Rodin in Meudon, which is Rodin's country house. You can see it in Antwerp. You can see it in Eindhoven. You can see it in Caracas, in Mexico City, in Melbourne, and in the Ashmolean in Oxford. You can see various forms of this sculpture. So again, it reinforces the point I'm making, that there is not one original. There are versions of the original. There are versions of parts of this which were all produced and seen as works of art in their own right. In fact, in the Ashmolean, this is what you will see: the head of Balzac, described as the head before the last study, which illustrate how parts of Rodin's sculpture acquire a life and identity of their own. If you go to the Ashmolean, you will also find the obligatory version of the Thinker on the left there. This one is 36 inches high, compared with the life-size figure on Rodin's grave. But you also find some sketches which illustrate Rodin's way of working. Apparently he liked his models to move around rather than adopt a static posture, so that he could capture the sense of movement. And Rodin had studied as a painter and draftsman, and he produced many sketches and watercolours. In fact, over 7,000 of them. And these were working tools, if you like. These were things that he used in the creation of his sculpture. They were not necessarily for public display. And here are 2 of them from the early 20th century, when Rodin was starting to become very famous indeed. So 1900 is an important year for Rodin. There's yet another Exposition Universelle, or World's Fair, in Paris in 1900. The one in 1889 had seen the construction of the Eiffel Tower, but the 1900 World Fair was all about the modern world, the new century was being celebrated. So the metro was extended, the Pont Alexandre III, which is on the right of this map, was built to link 2 of the sites of the exposition. If you've been up to Montmartre and up the funicular railway there, that was built for the 1900 exhibition. The Grand and the Petit Palais on the Champs-Élysées were built, and everything was in the new artistic style, or Art Nouveau. There were 50 million visitors who attended the fair, linked, as was customary at the time, to the Olympic Games, which formed part of it. But Rodin decided to take a leaf out of Courbet's book. If you've heard my talk on Courbet, he had his own pavilion at exhibitions, and Rodin decided to do the same thing. So he created the Exposition Rodin, which was part of the World's Fair. And you can see on the map here, most of the exhibition was around the Eiffel Tower and the Champ de Mars, the Trocadero opposite, and the area around the Grand and Petit Palais on the Champs-Élysées and in front of the Invalides. But Rodin had his exhibition on the what looks like the, obviously be the right bank, wouldn't it? I was going to say north, but I don't think it is the north bank of the Seine, where you can see it illustrated. A exhibition devoted entirely to the works of Rodin. And Rodin filled his exhibition with plaster casts in a representation of his studio. And because it was overwhelmingly white, because of the colour of the plaster, it was felt to link Rodin with the world of classical sculpture, which, as everyone knew, was fashioned of white marble. In fact, this was a misapprehension perpetrated by one of the most influential art historians and archaeologists of the 18th century, Johann Winkelmann. He assumed, because all the sculptures he'd seen were plain white, that was how they were created. It's now thought actually that classical sculptures were painted, but of course the paint hasn't survived, just the white marble has been left. So Rodin here has a very commercial approach to art, as Courbet had. He funded the exhibition with support from 3 bankers. He took 2/3 of the profit, 50% of the sales of reproduction, and so this acted as a shop window and brought in many commissions. You can see, I don't know why Friday was so expensive. You had to pay 5 francs to come in on a Friday, but if you waited to Sunday, you could get in for nothing. The pavilion was dismantled in 1901 and reconstructed in the grounds of Rodin's house at Meudon on the outskirts of Paris. In the early 20th century, Rodin was the go-to artist for portrait busts. Anyone who was anyone went to sit for Rodin. There's 2 of the examples here, George Bernard Shaw on the left and Gustav Mahler on the right, all produced by Rodin. Rodin died of influenza in 1917 at the age of 77 after suffering a stroke the previous year. He left his studio and its contents to the nation, and these form the basis of 2 museums. The Musée Rodin, which you see here, opened in 1919 in the centre of Paris, very close to Les Invalides. This was in fact his workshop rather than his home. His home in Meudon, just outside Paris, is where he's buried, and that opened as a museum in 1948. So that's the story of Auguste Rodin, an important sculptor of the late 19th and early 20th century. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. If you'd like to listen to some other talks that I've done, you can go to my YouTube channel, which is called Art for Art's Sake. There's a link on the screen in front of you now, and there are a number of other talks on the subject of various artists and art movements. But I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Thank you for listening.